So we've had a range of different speakers across the week, and we've got a focus this morning on thinking about what works really well in secondary education and in further education to enable young people to be included. And I'm just going to say at the start, before we ask you to kind of introduce yourself in the box, and we've got a particular way of doing that really. We are going to record, so if you've got any objection, I would suggest you put your camera off if you don't want to be seen by everybody, if you're not bothered, because I'd love millions of people to see this film, but maybe it won't be millions, it will just be those like you and me who are really committed to inclusion. Where to start with inclusion? It's obviously such an incredible topic. I think probably many of us are absolutely sick and tired of talking about SEND. I know I am. I want to talk about being able, being enabled, being able to be included. And those conversations have begun to diminish in my part of the world, and I possibly think in yours too. We know from the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled Persons feedback to our government in February 2018 that there's a recognition that we're becoming more segregated, and particularly at secondary level in the English system, not the UK, particularly in the English system. So a real concern about what's happening with inclusion. And actually the people that we've got here today obviously are two speakers and any of their friends that they've brought with them, because I think that is the case with Marion. We've got incredible practice, and thankfully we all know of some of that somewhere, don't we? I know I do. And it's exciting and liberating when we see it in operation, but it's not on everybody's lips and it isn't on everybody's agenda. So part of our compassionate agitation at NDTi, the National Development Team for Inclusion, is to make sure that we get people talking about inclusion again, and we keep on pushing that agenda as we get the SEN review reporting nationally in April or May. We think it's going to be after Easter. So if you've only just arrived and you've heard a woman waffling on, I'm Pat Bullen. I'm in the chair this morning. I'm the Preparing for Adulthood Regional Advisor for Yorkshire and Humber region. And what I'm going to do now is ask you, and I want you all to do it at the same time. So you've got to patiently put in the chat box your name, what your role is, what you do, and one thing about inclusion. It can be a great thing, or it can be something that's troubling you about inclusion and what we need to do. So your name, your role, and one thing about inclusion. And then I'm going to do a countdown, 3, 2, 1, and ask you all to put it in the chat box at the same time so that we get that chat box shower. And if you've got your notifications on, you'll get an awful lot of beeping as well. Just a reminder about your notifications. So I hope you're typing readily, and I'm going to do my countdown. Oh, Sarah, you've got off to a false start. You've just come out of the blocks too early. 3, 2, 1. Press your buttons. Sarah LeGood's the first one there. There you go. Becca, and you're a deputy head of school in Milton Keynes College. Anthony, public. Oh, I can't keep up with the box now. Polly Slade's a learning mentor in the virtual school. Jill's a behaviour support. Carol is an inclusive learning practitioner. We've got Kristen, who's a speech and language therapist. We've got Alex, who's a SEND officer. Nikki, who is a parent. David is an SEN officer. Julie's a parent. Jan Morton. We've got Annette Spear, who is a learning support team leader in Bristol at the City College there. We've got Marion, thank goodness, because she's one of our speakers. Leah Cooper, Senko. We've got Sam Black, who's the post-16 lead in Durham. Lisa is a team manager for behaviour outreach. Genevieve's a job coach in North Cambridgeshire. We've got Katia, working for Candle as an AAC specialist teacher. Sally's a transition coordinator. Ashley is an inclusion officer in St Helens. And Sarah is a project coordinator. And some of your thinking, inclusion is the way we should be working all of the time. Yeah, standard 5 if you're a teacher. Julie would like to develop more inclusive practice in secondary schools. John's here. He's a pushy parent. He's Georgie's dad. And he does other things too, but that's how we see him. To see his daughter just doing normal things in normal places, that sounds like a pretty good ambition. Ordinary, glorious lives. I'm just going to go up the chat box again. Deborah, in mainstream school, using strategies for supporting deaf children in the right way, doing the right thing by those young people. And some of you have, I think, remembered to put your name and your title in, but maybe didn't have time to put something about inclusion in. And Richard, who's PEP in Derby City, says inclusion takes love. I love that. So that's only a few of what you've said. There are lots of things that you've been able to share with us in the chat box. We've got two cracking speakers today, and we also want to hear from you, and the chat box is going to be, because of numbers, a really good way to hear from you. Julie is here too. She's the Children and Young People's Lead at NDTi, and inclusion means all. So that's lovely. Children are children, says Linda. Yeah, they are, aren't they? And don't you get sick and tired of having to try and describe someone because people want to know what the label is? Let's get rid of the labels. That will be good, wouldn't it? So I'm looking at Marion and Sarah, and I'm hoping that you're ready to kick us off this morning and get us talking. And Marion, I don't think I've got slides from you, but I think that Sarah's going to start. Oh, that's my dog, sorry. He's having a good bark, and I can't do anything about it. So what I'm going to say is, if I put myself on mute, Sarah, can I bring you in? Trevor doesn't be left out of the conversation.
So good morning, everyone. I'm just going to check from Pat. Can you just nod to say that you can see my presentation? So smashing. So first of all, I feel extremely proud to have been asked to contribute to the conference, and I've dipped in and out of a variety of the sessions through the week, and what I'd really have loved to have done, and my full inclusion geek will become apparent as we go through this, but what I'd really love to have done is actually been able to take a week off work to attend the sessions and plan how I was going to then take those threads of inclusive inspiration and weave them into my work on a daily basis. But unfortunately, the rest of the world has carried on. So I've done my very best. I've attended what I've been able to. What I would say is I'm really happy to take questions as we go. I've planned to talk to you between 30 and 40 minutes. However, when I get excited, I speak really quickly. And so if it's starting to get really quickly, somebody please shout up and just ask me to slow down, and that will really help me. That would be perfect. So I'm part of the SEND Centres for Excellence, and I'm the Director of Inclusion at a large college in the Midlands. And we've been working on our inclusion agenda for, well, all of the time I've been in that organisation. So I was given free rein, and I've been able to do, I think I've been able to start some really good work. So hopefully we'll share that with you and talk a little bit about why we think it's okay what we've done and what the plan is for next. So the first part for me is that obviously we've got a variety of people in this session, and you're responsible for your own management during the session. So if your dog needs to bark, your child needs to get on your knee, you need to go and run around in the back garden to refresh your brain, you need to go and make a cup of coffee, or in my case, refill your hot water bottle, please feel free to do that. But throughout, your voice in this discussion is the most valid part of the discussion. So I'm going to share with you what we do. But actually, and I was so proud that Pat said compassionate agitation, that's how I identify myself. So when I'm working with parents, with young people, with my teaching teams, my support teams, our local authorities, and basically anybody else will listen, I set myself up as a compassionate agitator. And it's because some of the conversations around inclusion seem to be getting harder, not easier. And I think that's really strange, because we know this, we know the facts, we know the data, we know the aspirations of our young people. We know we need to work with our parents and young people to unlock those aspirations. and yet it feels like we may be slipping back. Now, my organisation's not slipping back, we're pushing forward, but there are no daft questions, so please feel free to ask. So the SEND Centres for Excellence were established 2 years ago, and we're just coming to the end of year 2, and we've got another year's worth of project funding, and so we're going to be slightly shifting what we're looking at, and in the next 12 months we'll be focusing really heavily on looking at enhanced transition, really enabling the people in that circle of support around a young person who comes to us and goes to other colleges or other post-16 providers, I should say, to really enable that aspiration. And I'll talk a little bit more about language as I go on, but there's a really clear thing about language for me. And so I don't like empowerment, I like enablement. Empowerment is based in the premise that I have power that I'm going to give to somebody else. It's within my gift, and that is not what we expect or what I expect from the teams that work with me and from the kind of the whole post-16 specialist sector. It's around the enablement of our young people. So there are 3 centres for excellence spread across the country. We've got a people theme which is led by Western College, and they did an absolutely amazing mental health conference yesterday around safeguarding mental health and kind of resilience and developing that, and some of their work is absolutely superb, so please feel free to have a look at them. We lead on curriculum, but it's the broadest interpretation of curriculum. So when we're working with other providers, we might start by looking at the intent on their marketing or website, and we might end the curriculum by how they celebrate progression for all students into a meaningful adult life outcome, which is an ordinary life, whether that ordinary life is higher education or semi-supported living. All of those outcomes have valid and equitable meaning. And the community strand is led by City College Norwich, and that's Elaine Dale at City College Norwich. The key thing around all of the 3 Centres for Excellence is that they are heavily supported by the senior leadership team and the principalship team in their colleges, and all 3 of the principals take an active part in supporting, guiding and mentoring other providers, other colleges who have recognised that they've got some distance to go, or they basically just want a compassionate agitator to ask them some questions about why they do what they do. And we then work with them to create a specific plan for the individual, for the organisation, from a leadership point of view or a community of practice point of view, to enable people to start asking those questions, creating a gap and expanding their provision into that gap, just like we would expect our young people to expand into the gap around their progression. So year 2 of the project has been around employability and progression, and as I've already said, year 3 there's a slight expansion to that, so it's going to be very much focused on good transition and celebrating some of the outcomes for our young people. So at Derby College, I arrived there about 7 years ago, and there was a flavour for change around inclusion and inclusive practice. The existing team had been through the self-assessment process, and they had self-assessed as outstanding in their work, and then Ofsted had arrived and they had a slightly different opinion, and so I was appointed in order to align the actual activity with the aspiration and with the thinking, but I was enabled and I was allowed to apply and to got the job based on the fact that I have the minimum performance, the minimum framework for performance around young people, every young person. The Ofsted outstanding grade is my minimum performance requirement. Why would I not aspire to something much bigger and much bolder than that? So the government guidelines, the legislation, that's the starting point for me. It's not the end point. You don't achieve Ofsted outstanding as a grade and that's it, you're done. You achieve that and then you work on how you're going to make sure that that's consistently embedded across our sector. So I've been really fortunate. So we use a community of practice model, and that's based in the Laven-Wenger community of practice model, which is that the more people in our community of practice who answer infrequently asked questions, and we share answers and generate answers together, the stronger provision becomes. And I'm really keen that in those communities of practice, the variety of people is broader. So currently we've got lots of practitioners, lots of leaders, lots of managers, and obviously some of those are parents, but it's really challenging to draw out a parent's voice and to work out how I can do a better job of transition. And it's really, really easy for me to talk to my young people in our provision, and we've got about 400 young people who've got an education, health and care plan, and we've got about 1,800 young people in the organisation who have an inclusion need, and they all have an individual teaching plan or an individual progression to employment plan. It's easy for me to hear their voice, but I need that kind of congruence between the messages. So the things that have worked for us is we have adopted a growth mindset. We do all of our change through transparent change discussions with everybody involved. Kaizen is the Japanese model of continuous improvement, and that's kind of the key. It's like a fancy plan, do, review version of the world, just like teaching in the olden days used to be when I used to crack on in a classroom. And lots of the changes that we work on for us and for other organisations are based in a design thinking model, which is a really simple 5-step model where you define the challenge, create an innovative solution and pilot it as an experiment. And if it works, you cascade it across an organisation. And if it doesn't work, you go back and you replan, you redo and you re-review. So it's really simple, but the simplest is the best. And this year, I'm adopting the approach of becoming an inclusion ally. And the definition for me around an inclusion ally is that compassionate agitator. And I'm going to reclaim the word inclusion. It's not about SEN, it's about including everyone. So the person in the chat who said it's about love, you are exactly right. That parity, that equity, that esteem of everybody is where my my individual motivation comes from. And if I don't know the answer, I need to go and find somebody whose lived experience will share their answer with me. And that's from a perspective of equity. So that's my kind of motivation. You know, nothing about us without us. If I can't see it, I can't be it. So very much based in those kind of key words that we use. Through the time I've been at Derby, I've got quite a big team. So currently we've got just shy of 220 staff who work in inclusion and enabling students to access teaching, learning and assessment towards their aspiration. And a few years ago, we identified ourselves as inclusionists. And we had a big staff development day where we looked at the definition of what an inclusionist is, and we began to act and to be inclusionists, because inclusion isn't something that happens in a terrapin on a car park. It isn't a department. It is an ethos, a way of being and a way of challenging ourselves. And when I wasn't really getting the traction that I needed as quickly as I wanted, I very openly stole a pledge from the Special Olympics. And that pledge we rewrote. And so our pledge is that we pledge as an inclusionist to look out for the lonely, isolated, left out and excluded. I pledge to overcome my fear of difference and replace it with the power of inclusion, because I am an inclusionist. And I will talk about it at the end, but there's a hyperlink in this presentation because the Special Olympics are asking for people to make their pledge for inclusion. Now, we were going to set up our own little special website where we were going to ask people to make that pledge. Well, I don't need to do that because it's already done. So that's, for me, the magic. And through the time we've been working, we've created an approach, and our mission is enabling everyone. And we had a big fancy mission statement, and we worked with young people. And guess what? It became enabling everyone, and it won't be changing anytime soon. So I'm going to talk about inclusion, and I'm going to ask you the key question. And this is part of the compassionate agitation bank of questions that I have, which is, why wouldn't we? So why wouldn't we be inclusive in our being, our thinking, our planning, in all of our intent, basically? This is probably a graphic that many of you will have seen before. And I think we can all trawl through our memory banks and we can all identify providers, employers, post-16 providers, schools who adopt one version of these models. So when we are consulted for a young person to come to our provision and we explain through the consultation process that we are not likely to be able to meet need, that's exclusion. And every time we have to have that conversation, and I'm going to go back to what Richard said about it needs to have love, it breaks my heart that a young person in my community where I am their college and I'm a public servant cannot come to our college. So if I give you the really tiny version of the world, last year we interviewed a young woman very late in August. We weren't consulted, she arrived and we couldn't meet her needs. Nobody else in our city could meet her needs and she became NEET and she's still NEET. So I've worked with the curriculum manager for the area that would be most appropriate for her to sit, and we have now created a bespoke, individualised study programme for her. And we started the process of supporting her to transition to us. And obviously she's much further back now than she was last August because of all that lost learning. And miraculously, 5 other young people have arrived, all with very similar backgrounds. So we've now made a bespoke, beautiful solution for one young person, and we will actually end up with a group. So that's our approach. Our whole approach is around inclusion. And in some respects, there's actually an element of integration because our specialist curriculum areas, which house less than half of our complex students, the majority of our complex students are across our organisation, but they are integrated. So there are specific curriculum areas that they work in. Ethically, I'm not a fan of that because I believe in inclusion, but I'm prepared to make that step change happen over a much longer period of time. And I've had lots of conversations with both Pat and Ellen Atkinson, who we've worked with for a while, about the fact that actually I think I'll probably end up retiring before true inclusion is across all of our education sectors. However, when I went to the international perspectives on inclusion session earlier in the week, it was absolutely heartwarming, and I've almost booked my trip to Canada to go and look at what they do and to look at how we can adopt some of their swift change mindset, which has been magic. So we all know the history, and I think it's really powerful to revisit some parts of Wolfensberger's role valorisation and normalisation approaches from the 70s, and that's where my career started. I was a specialist support worker in a MenCap group home, and it changed my life for the better in every way. We've got the Equality Act, we've got the SEN Code of Practice. Those of us working in post-16 have had the beauty of the Skills White Paper. We are integrating T-level provision. We've got the Education Inspection Framework. So let's face it, we've got legislation coming out of our ears. However, the fundamental premise is inclusion and inclusive practice, and it's how we get to that. And the challenge is we are all public sector providers, and therefore we are subject to the public sector equality duty. And for me, there's a magical word in that, which is around the anticipation of need. And so it should never be a shock to a school, a college, a private training provider, a specialist provider, that the young people that arrive with them may have complexity and may have adjustment that's needed. Now, I don't have SEN in my college. I don't have LLDD. I don't have additional. I don't have extra. We don't have a SENCO. We do have 10 inclusion coordinators, and I do have an EHCP coordinator, and I do have an exam access arrangement coordinator. We don't use any medically based descriptors. We use attribute-based language, and we very deliberately reject SEN. And it's really challenging, but I told you at the beginning I was a compassionate agitator. So if people ask, which is the magic of why you don't have SEN and why you've not got a SENCO, the right response is the same reason that we don't have additional needs, extra needs. We don't have an inclusion unit because it's not inclusive. So if you imagine talking to a young person at 14, 15 or 16 about their outcomes and preparation for adulthood and telling them all of the lovely stuff that they can aspire to, if you give them this extra, this additional, this special, it's not enabling, it's not empowering, and it also isn't realistic, because for the majority of my young people, they do want to move into a bog standard, average, ordinary, cracking life. And we talk about things like independence. So I've had a really challenging and ongoing conversation with a specialist outside my organisation about independence. And well, sometimes we can never aspire to independence for a child or for a young person. Well, I'm 50 and I'm not independent. I've got a circle of people around me, and I'm very fortunate that circle of people around me love me and accept me. And they also remind me of where the limits and the lines are. And they also remind me when I'm wobbling that I do things really well. And when I'm doing really well, they remind me that I can do more. And they remind me that I can make choice. So for me, the definition or the delineation of independence is not about being able to strike out into the world and not actually need anything or do anything without anybody else's support. The definition of independence is as meaningless as choosing what I can have for my tea and being able to shop for it, or as complex as deciding I'm going to travel the world and I'm going to travel on my own, but with lots of other people. So I think there's something around that intent and that independence and that the kind of the wider version of inclusion that we really need to celebrate. I think the challenge for me is around the statistics, and Pat alluded to this at the beginning. We all know the statistics. We all know, or we should, that only 6% of our young people with learning disability will go into work. So for the hundreds of millions of pounds that our government pours into specialist provision, we deliver 6% of those young people into a sustained working outcome. And my estimation is that 95% of that cohort could be in work, paid or unpaid. I don't have a judgment on that, but they could be in work. When you then delve into that and look at some of the data that sits around those statistics, and COVID, I think, has given us another lens to look at learning disability through, the data is more grim than we actually imagine, because we've got young people who, if you're 18 to 30 and you have a learning disability, you're 30 times more likely to die of COVID. Even this morning on the BBC, people with a learning disability were given an automatic do not resuscitate by our NHS when they got COVID. You are more likely to die younger. You're more likely to experience mental health difficulty. You're more likely to have poor health because you've got poor access to health services. So go back to my question, which is why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we want to change what we do and change how we do it in order to enable our young people to make those meaningful adult life choices and to progress successfully into the world of work and that bog standard ordinary life? So I think some of the work and some of the conversation for people in this session is around how we can do that, the enablement and the enactment of that enablement. So we can have all the great thoughts in the world, but so what? What difference will that make? What will we do with that knowledge and that skill and that information? So the first thing that I like to do is make a plan. So there I am on my bike, and you can see the goal, and it's very clear, and the incline isn't too menacing, and I really do think it's achievable. And I think every single person in this this session and every single person who's attended the Inclusion Festival throughout the week has got really clear passion about that, and they are here to learn, and they're here to kind of be challenged or prompted or sharing of best practice, and that's great. But we're all in it already. We're all doing it already. We might not be doing it to the very best of our ability. so we can always share, but we're doing it already. It's the people who aren't doing it already that are the toughest nut to crack, in my opinion, in this version of our world. So we've adopted the use of key information, key levers for change, key conversation starters. So one is the social model of disability, and I will drop into the chat after this a couple of key pieces of reference that we use. So we use a scope video and we use an animation that's called The Problem of the Able-Bodied. And it's a magical, really short 3-minute piece that we've shared with lots of people around starting their conversation, around their concepts around ability and disability. And for our teaching teams and our advanced practitioner teams, it's been key in opening the gap in their mind to think differently. Now I'm showing you the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross change curve, and she's another kind of majorly influential woman on my thinking and my life and my professional work. So she basically did some research into our emotional responses to grief. So this is the grief curve. And later on, it's been changed and moved into kind of the acceptance of change. And one of the most effective elements of how we can work with people, and obviously you're kind of, whether you're a parent, whether you're a young person, whether you're somebody who's experienced because you've got an older child who's been through the education and care system, starting the conversation and accepting the guidance is very challenging, particularly when you're being told by the school or a local authority or whoever you're working with about the deficit, detriment, difficulty, special based version of your young person or the world. And having recently worked with a variety of parents, I think that some of the work can be improved at a much earlier age, and that's around the validation and the acceptance of a child when it's born. So we delivered a conference a couple of weeks ago, and Nancy Gedge, who's a blogger and she works in a secondary school, spoke as our keynote speaker, and that was over 2 weeks ago, and it's still rattling round and it's still reverberating. The ripple of what she said is still impacting on me. And basically what she said was, she's got a son who's 20, he's just leaving college, he wants to go into work, he doesn't want to work in a community cafe, which is what the guidance he's said that he should do. He has Down syndrome, and she described when she had him, when she gave birth, and that she looked at him, and because of the experience that she'd had, she was asked a few key questions. So, did you know? Well, that would have made a difference. Aren't you brave? And she was left with a feeling that her son wasn't real. He got no real chances, he got no real aspirations to look forward to, and she's carried that for 20 years. And so some of the work is around actually that conversation and starting from that perspective of attribute-based validity and really challenging ourselves to think about unlocking aspiration and unlocking potential, rather than making a sweeping set of judgments internally that means that we are limiting aspirations for our young people. And it's really difficult, isn't it? You know, I've had conversations recently about being a one-armed plasterer. So I showed somebody a video of a one-armed pianist and said, well, if he can be a pianist, I can't see why we can't have a one-armed plasterer. Let's work on how we're going to do, what we're going to do to enable that young person to reach their aspiration of becoming a plasterer. So we go back to the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross change curve. So we've got our plan. There it is. It's really simple. It's to indoctrinate the world to become inclusionists so that they challenge their bias, compassionately agitate everybody, and impact on the lives of every young person in order for them to be able to live a lovely, long, meaningful life. And we think about the emotions that that's going to bring, and we try and mitigate some of those emotions in our discussions. So when we're talking to young people, if you want a job, you can come to college. That kind of stark reality. And then we get the real version of the change curve. So there I am on my bike. I've not managed to add a graphic around a pandemic. I don't know whether any of you've noticed, but we are having a pandemic. And it's really stretched and challenged us as far as how we approach the change and what we do. But we also know, just like we know the cohort of young people that are coming to our organisations, we also know that these challenges are along the way, and we can mitigate some of these challenges. And for me, one of the magical things that we can do is we can mitigate challenges by changing and developing the way we offer curriculum. So the actual building blocks of a post-16 study programme are absolutely flexible. They have the magic of being able to be totally bespoke and individualised to that individual student. And it's how you actually enact that and make that happen. So we do a series of workshops around the actual curriculum and the flexibility of curriculum and how we have adapted that to develop, for example, in one area of our work, we just develop a RAPA curriculum, which is linked to education, health and care plan outcomes or aspirations. So we don't use qualifications at all. In another area, we've got a merged offer where we offer some qualifications and some outcome-based work. And then cross college, we've got students studying at level 3 who aren't doing any qualifications because they are on RAPA-based programmes, as well as at every other level in every other discipline. And also we are looking at adjusting far more our apprenticeship offers to make sure that we've made full use of the flex that we've got. That's then led us to managing and supporting staff. So part of the challenge around this ongoing inclusion approach is that people tend to look back. So if I give you an example from my world, and I'm sure some of you will have done sessions or done training or had feedback, I can go into a session and I can do a teaching session for 20 or 30 people. And in the olden days, they would all fill in a paper form at the end in order for somebody to process, to look at what was going well and what wasn't going well. And I could have 30 pieces of paper and I would very quickly sift through the 30 to find a bad one. I'd very quickly go to the negative. I'd very quickly look at what I needed to do better. And I know that's going to happen. So we then have other discussions with our teaching team, our support team, about acceptance and about managing them and managing their well-being, their resilience. So again, there's only compassion. There's no shock. There's no blame. There should be no guilt. It is what it is. We've been where we've been and we need to move towards a different model. And so that we move towards gradual acceptance. And once we get to that gradual acceptance around change to an inclusive approach, we actually start to be able to unlock people to innovate far more quickly. And that's the magic for me when we work with our staff, our students and different organisations. And that's the kind of the rationale as to what happens. Why? Well, the stark fact is that we're living in a very different world, and that, as the slide says, 60% of today's 12-year-olds will do jobs that don't yet exist. So I've got a young person who left us a few years ago. He was mad keen on programming and he wanted to be a programmer. And his autism had really challenged the secondary education phase to enable him to have a positive experience. And by the time we engaged with him, he was basically choosing to live in a very safe bubble in his bedroom. So we did lots of work on transition, lots of work on pre-work and on identifying the people who would support him, lots of work on understanding him. He came to us, did a couple of years worth of study and progressed into a job. And he now programs grass. So he creates the coding for grass in computer games. It's a major specialism. He absolutely loves it. And guess what? He can work in his bedroom and he socialises with his team through Microsoft Teams or through Zoom. So he's living his best life, earning money and managing himself and managing his resilience. So it's how we work to create those opportunities and those avenues to jobs that don't yet exist. It's really difficult to think and to conceptualise, and that's why the industry and businesses need to be really part of our curriculum planning, because they are the people who need to create inclusive employment opportunities and to understand the flexibility that they have in inclusive employment, job carving, and taking the kind of traditional rule book around jobs and actually tearing it up and remaking it into something that will enable that 95% of the cohort we're talking about to get into a job and be part of our wider communities and meet all of their PFA outcomes. A job brings far more than a wage. A job brings the opportunity to be part of and connected to something in our local community. I actually think the pandemic will be fantastic for quite a lot of my young people who are working in digital and media, because the job market has opened up incredibly. So jobs are no longer local, they're no longer national. We've now got people who are looking at international job adverts to be able to work in organisations that are based in India, America, and there's a real opportunity for them to do that and to work in that different way. So it's how we work on making sure our inclusive approach and our curriculum meets that need. Key change things for us. So we have leadership at every level, and everybody comes to the conversation and contributes to our change and change planning. So in quite a lot of our sessions, we have a variety of staff who will come and talk about their experience of embedding a RAPA-based curriculum, their experience of going into schools and doing the starting blocks of transition work, regardless of their roles. So it's everybody's job to be a first follower. And the first follower model is that really the leader and the person who's working on it in an organisation is already bought in. It's the people who you can develop and bring with you along the way to enable them to become first followers and start to have those compassionately agitating conversations and really challenge what the establishment, what the organisation and what individual teachers do in their approach. As I said at the beginning, we're developing an allyship approach to inclusion, and it's the widest version of inclusion around all of the protected characteristics and beyond. So what do we need to do? And we're thinking now about how we can respond around the intersectionality of people to make sure that our responses are really sophisticated based on their intersectionality. So it's not just my learning disability or my learning difficulty or my physical impairment that we are working alongside to try and mitigate. It's every element of that person. So when we don't have to think about somebody being a 17-year-old gay Muslim plumber, that's when we've reached the point where we've actually planned effectively, so we don't have to consider any of those intersectionality elements of that person. That's what we need to do. So I'll ask you the same question, why wouldn't we? And really from this discussion, is there one action that you might take? Is there one thing that you might do? Is there one thing that you might want to work with us on and might want to challenge us to be better, think better and be better about? And we use how might we questions. So how might we ensure that a 17-year-old Muslim gay plumbing student who's dyslexic has exactly what they need from the outset? How might we get to that point? And so you might want to develop or ask me how might we questions that I can then support and respond to. The graphic on this slide is around the zone of proximal development, and I think you can extrapolate that. You can take this to our practice. So some practitioners can't do inclusion, and some practitioners can do inclusion really easily. And what my job is, I think, is to push people out into that zone of proximal development and to really make sure that people are enabled to have that conversation and to be able to work in that way, to push ourselves beyond our bias and beyond what we kind of accept is the norm, and we accept the language. I believe in linguistic determinism. If we speak about young people from an attribute base, they will achieve more, and there's research that backs that up. So as I've already said, we tend to try and go beyond the guidance. So what's your plan on looking beyond the guidance? So if you want to become an inclusionist, there's an opportunity to sign that pledge, and I'll drop that pledge, the link to that pledge into the chat after this. That really it's the iteration, it's the intent of nothing about us without us. That compassionate agitation, understanding that people's starting points are going to be very different, but shame and challenge will not enable any of us to change. And I think we are, I'm talking to people in this session who are interested and invested. I'm talking to the people who are passionate and who believe. It's how we are going to impact on those who are less focused and less passionate, not because they want to do a bad job, but because they're doing all of the other things in order to maintain their life. So it's, will you join me really as the compassionate and considerate agitator? and can we develop and generate people who've got that lived experience that can really inform us about how we get to our work being based in equity, validity, and the social model of inclusion, not the social model of disability. It's beyond inclusion for me. It's beyond a social model of disability. So that brings me to the end, and I'll just stick the links into the chat about what we do as a Centre for Excellence in case anybody wants to share or to work on that and to share good practice with us. And I know I've talked a lot, but thank you very much.
It was great. You got us really quite engaged and agitated, because we started to have a chat in the chat box, and Artemi had a bit of difficulty because Artemi wanted to give everyone a thumbs up and couldn't do it easily. So we can see some people. We've got at least one hand up. I'm just checking who it is. It's Genevieve.
Oh, thank you. I was going to say, I think there's another one possibly as well, but that was absolutely fantastic, and I agree so wholeheartedly. For myself with the pledge, I think it's cutting jobs into what the skills are and focusing there, rather than what I used to call, when I was working in secondary schools, the ABC of jobs: A for actor, B for baker, C for if we look at the skill sets, it's so much easier to look at the attributes of a person and focus on how well they fit within those particular interests and opportunities, because their passion is already in those skills, and how we can make the reasonable adjustments to get there. Do you have any guides on other places where you can learn about attribution language and share? Because it's something I want to kind of get really working in my network.
So what I would suggest, Genevieve, and I love your name, by the way, is I've dropped into the chat the link to our Centre for Excellence. So the way we work on those kind of activities is we have a monthly community of practice, and it can be themed, or it's very kind of free. We don't tend to have an agenda, but we come along and have a discussion. And then I think it's now on the 29th of April, there's a session on, it's called the Language of Inclusive Curriculum, and it was very much based in that attribute-based model, and that's a reflection of a piece of work that I've done within my organisation about taking the advanced practitioner team to a point where they are ultra confident, because they weren't confident with the language they were using, and that was really challenging for them. So a lot of the work has been based in how we've worked with them. So we've done big pieces of work. But there's also a superb BBC documentary, and again I'll find the link and put it in the chat, that was aired a couple of months ago around history and around not specifically around language, but around the history of how we talk about learning disability and learning difficulty. And we've used that for flipped learning, so we'd send it out to people for them to watch before we then have the conversation, so you've got something to draw them back to. Pat, I'm going to shut up because I'll just keep going.
We don't like you shutting up. But Adela, I think, wants to come in and make a comment or ask another question.
I just wanted to say, well, ask you, Sarah, is that I agree with everything you say, because as a practitioner and a mother in very similar circumstances, I agree with all what you say, and it's very real. But, you know, sort of, if you have a title as a SEN tutor or inclusivity, now, how will we go about of actually getting everyone to use the titles of inclusivity? Because even if you're using some of the government legislation documents, they refer as SEN, and you know, and that's deemed as the terminology, where obviously inclusive is a far sort of appropriate manner to take, because you know, I can share lots of things with you as a mother, but equally it's always about being inclusive and not being the odd one out. So that is a far better, you know, sort of, when even now I have that sort of discussion where I'm classed as a SEN and things like that. Yeah, it's inclusive practice. How could we get to the stage where everyone is actually working under the same umbrella?
Well, I think the challenge is it's a bit like a hamburger. So for me, the Department for Education is the meat, and they need to feel squeeze from above and below. So I agree, it's very, very challenging, and it's taken a long time in my organisation, and it's about consistent persistence.
Yeah.
So in an organisation, I think it's really easy to start having that conversation and saying, you know what, are we happy to just like do what everybody else does and be like bog standard, or do you want to really, really strap on a massive pair of inclusion balls and do something that's going to push us beyond? And it's really hard. However, the simplest vehicle I think a lot of people have is the voice of the young people that we're talking about, the voice of the parents. You know, we're called the Inclusion and Support Service in the college, and our curriculum areas are called Pathway to Independence and Pathway to Working Life. And all of those names were generated in full consultation with our stakeholders. So I think there's that. And also, when we started our work on the Centre for Excellence, so we'd been sharing practice for 5 years before we became a Centre for Excellence, because you can only get better if you can look outside your organisation to what other people are doing really well. And so I see it as being a magpie, and you go out and you collect the magical stuff and you bring it back and you polish it and you go out again. And I think the sector is powerful.
Yeah. I do agree, and equally, you know, from my own experience, I remember my daughter being 3, having a few health issues, so still in a pushchair, and the consultant, and you know, she's gone on to do different things, and said to my daughter, because obviously she had a few additional needs, and basically when they asked what she wanted to do, she actually turned around and says to my daughter, oh, I should aim you sort of heights lower than that. I'm not going to say a name. And absolutely, you know, absolutely broke her in. And she's due to graduate from Sheffield University this year. Yes, we've had a journey, a long, long journey with her, but she's got there, and hopefully she will get a job. But, you know, when you're talking to top consultants who tell your daughter to, you know, it
Aim
says a lot.
lower.
Yeah.
Isn't it interesting though? Why would we ever say to any, well, I would never say to any member of staff or any student in my organisation, aim lower. I'm just going to respond. Adam's put something in the chat and I totally agree. So Adam, the acknowledgement of individuals and the labels and the choices they make is absolutely key. It's that respectful perspective. So, for example, I'm uncomfortable with autism spectrum disorder because it's a disorder, and something with a disorder is broken. A disabled toilet is a toilet that's disabled, it's broken. I don't use those terms. However, when I meet a young person, if they identify as an Aspie, or they tell me they are an autist or autistic, I make sure that I remember and I use the description that they favour in that. So their view, their voice is the key for me. And their voice is only as valid as my voice, and my voice is only as valid as theirs. And when there's 5 of them and there's 1 of me, then they overtake and they win. But until then, I'm going to continue to push that we actually look for that challenge and that change.
I like it, and that fits, I think, with where many of us are trying to tread in an empathetic way around gender recognition, because that's a point of transition. And when people describe self, we need to respond to that. So why wouldn't we? Again, you know, why wouldn't we do that to acknowledge what an individual is experiencing and living? Julie wants to come in. Thanks, Julie.
I was just going to say the same thing really around names. So, you know, we ask people, don't we, would you like to be called Victoria or Vicky or Nicola or Nikki? It's kind of a similar thing. But Sarah, one of the things that's come up during the course of this week is trying to push forward on an inclusion charter. So thinking about how we can have, we want some national steer, I guess, ultimately. Certainly NDTi would like some national steer. And just having a quick look at the web link that you put in the chat box, do you think that's enough, or do you think it is something that yeah, okay, I kind of thought you were going to say that, really. I mean, I think for us, certainly for NDTi, it's something we want to look at moving forward to try and drive for a national charter, which could sit alongside the pledge, I guess. Okay, you've answered, well, I've answered my own question, really. Thank you.
Any more comments or questions for Sarah before we move? And we've deliberately confounded you today. We could have gone secondary and then FE, but where would be the fun in that, really? That would be predictable, wouldn't it? That would say life's linear and we go through a process, and of course life isn't. And I'm looking to see if there's any questions. I can see a hand, but I'm not sure if it's, I
think it's Adam.
It's Adam. Hi Adam, there you are. Thank you.
Hi, yeah, it is me. Thank you. Also, I just kind of talking about kind of a charter and the way forward, and I think, you know, I think everyone who's here would definitely want a much more inclusive education system, and a much more inclusive society. But obviously the government and policymakers are going to be a massive part of that. But kind of in your opinion, what would be the, I don't know, there's so much to change, but top few things that you would actually want to change? What could actually happen to create this change? We all want the change, but how would you suggest we kind of start with that?
Well, I think it is that huge. The opportunities are massive. However, Disability Rights UK released a document in November last year, and it's called We Belong. And it's an ethos and an approach, and they give 5 key guidance directives, and they're giving those guidance and those directives to the government as part of their disability. Oh, I've just lost the word. They're releasing this year a new disability strategy. No, well, yeah, but basically it's a piece of research that's been done by Disability Rights UK, and it's nothing about us without us. So it's based in research, in, you know, person-centered research with individuals with disability. It's much broader than just learning disability. So it's disability generally, and it gives 5 key recommendations. One is the national embedding of the use of the social model, so that people actually have that conversation and start that discussion around change and around why we don't use that language in those descriptors. So I think that's one thing that for me would be really key in every organisation. In teaching, they actually specify that every teacher should be taught about the social model of disability. And I believe that should actually be extrapolated out, and no teacher should be able to leave teacher training without knowing how to teach inclusively. So I think they're the kind of key things. There's, you know, really regular stuff like the way we ask questions. So for example, I'm trying really hard to challenge myself, Adam, and to be better at being inclusive in my practice, as in operational practice. So when I'm delivering conferences, I actually want to develop a flipped model. So I want to, you know, you go to a conference, and in the olden days you'd arrive, you'd get your bag, you'd pick up your pens, and then you'd go into the conference and they'd fill your brain, but you'd have like booty before you got there. Whereas I'm hoping that when we're delivering in the 3rd year of our project, we deliver a flipped model. So if you've got sensory difficulty, if you're dyslexic, sessions like this aren't always as accessible as they can be. So why wouldn't I send you the PowerPoint presentation beforehand? And why wouldn't you then be able to contact me and say, Sarah, that bit's great, but I don't actually get that bit, or blah, blah, blah. And I can then adapt and adjust my presentation to make sure I'm inclusive, and I'm routinely providing things that are subtitled or that are on the correct colour background or whatever. So it's those things. I think it's individual practitioners making a difference, because then when you go to an event, you think, well, yeah, why haven't I done that? You know, just simple thing. I'm sorry, I'm giving a really long-winded answer, Pat.
We like detail and big picture thinking. We need both, don't we? And I Adam might want to come back on that, but what it made me think of, Sarah, is Laura McInerney, writing in Education Guardian at the weekend, said that there's a bit of a slow dawning recognition in some schools and colleges that some young people have begun to close the gap, particularly those with additional needs during this period, because they've been able to go to that blended learning approach. They've been able to look at the resource 3, 4, 10 times, and they've been able to stop it and slow it down process, use their executive functioning skills. And so there's actually been some narrowing of the gap, to use the language of Ofsted, where it might not have been expected. So actually, why wouldn't we think differently about the way we use pedagogy?
Yeah, and that's,
yeah,
I was going to say that's something that I've been doing for a while, and that LGFL have been doing. I deliver, so at the TSN show a few years ago, I delivered a session about getting your head in the cloud, because we've been quite proactive on kind of the cloud platforms and what they can offer and how they can be so good for inclusion. So we've been doing quite a lot of work on that, and obviously that's now been massively accelerated because more schools than ever before have a cloud platform. So the whole idea of flipped learning and all the benefits that brings, completely aside from the tools like immersive reader and those kinds of things, just about your pedagogy and the fact it's not, I must hold on to all the knowledge until the lesson because otherwise I won't have something to say. So yeah, that's something that we've kind of been promoting and trying to push with everyone.
It's so exciting. I feel like giddy, but I think one of the other challenges, and it goes back to, I think it was Adela's comment about the limiting beliefs of advice and guidance, or of her young person, her daughter. For me, what you're describing, Adam, is my kind of the epitome of magnificence when I look at teaching is a ballsy teacher who starts the year, and this will probably freak some of you out, but starts the year with no scheme of work, no scheme of learning. And in the first 2 weeks, they take those young people and they build the scheme together. And the young people are then enabled to understand why they're doing this on week 1 in order to get them to week 36, GCSE, A-level, BTEC, epiphany, progression. Why? And then they understand the layering of assessment, and then they're enabled and they know what's coming, and they are turned on by what they're going to do, and it's sexy and they love it. And then what you do is you create the opportunity for consistent pre-learning, for consistent flipped learning, and you then create the ability to push those students right to the edge of that zone of proximal development, so they are exceeding their expectations. Now, it doesn't matter to me whether it's because they want to be able to go to Tesco, buy the stuff to cook spag bowl for 4 people and clean a kitchen, or whether it's because they want to know how to automate the painting of the Forth Bridge. I don't care what the outcome is, but that collaborative, cohesive pedagogy is magic. I'm going to shut up, Pat.
Well, I was just going to say I could listen all day, but I know I'm going to feel like that about Mary and Katia and colleagues as well at Kendal. So I'm going to let Adela, because she's a parent, have the last word.
As a parent, and obviously gone through everything, and I totally agree. And all I can say is to Peter Benyon, who is one of sort of Sarah's colleagues, all I can turn around and say, if it wasn't for him and being there for my daughter and absolutely supporting her for 2 years, she wouldn't be where she is today, and she certainly wouldn't have had the opportunities. So I have to say thank you to that. And also then, as a practitioner, as Sarah said about the scheme of work, I actually also deliver teacher training, and I do a big thing on inclusive teaching. And what I have said to them that are going out to teach and will graduate this year, I've said to them, you need to ensure that you meet all your learners before you plan and start your scheme of work, because how can you put a scheme of work in place if you've not met them learners? With everyone's an individual. You cannot put a scheme of work together until you've met those learners, because how will you meet their needs? So thank you for that, Sarah. It's been absolutely fantastic.
Hey, what a lovely way to complete this part. I mean, it doesn't mean that we're ending, but complete this part of the session. Thanks so much, Sarah. I know that you made Charlie smile. She's got a set of footballs behind her, I can see on a shelf, and she liked your cojones remark several times. So brilliant start, and I'm not going to waste any more time with me, because I want to move to Marion, Katia, and I think Marion, another of your friends and colleagues.
Leah.
So hi there. We're going to hand over to you for you to introduce yourselves, and we can show slides if that's easier for you. My colleague Rebecca will do so.
Okay, that's great. Yes, please.
Okay, so we would love to know who you are, where you're from, and what you're going to talk with us about today.
Are you going to throw up our slides for us then?
Yeah, I thought you could do your intros while Rebecca puts your slides up. And thank you for sending them.
I'm Marion Stanton, and I lead an organisation called Candle, as you can see on the slide there, and I'm here today with Katia and Leah. Say hi, Katia and Leah.
Hiya. Hoping you can hear me.
Hi, Leah. So yeah, Katia is one of the teachers that works in our organisation, and she works preliminary in the school that Leah is the Senko of, called Impington Village College. So today, our Impington Village College, which is a secondary school in Cambridgeshire, is something we want to focus on. But before I do, I just want to say a little bit about Candle and what we do, and a little bit about where I've come from and why my journey to this point. So Candle is a growing organisation, which is a rare thing to hear in a time like this. But because we're a not-for-profit and we're not really tied to the rules, regulations and red tape that so many schools have been, struggling through the last year, we've been able to kind of cut through a lot of that and support students with disabilities effectively through remote learning. And we've in fact grown substantially in the last year. We've now got teachers and teaching assistants and resource makers working all over the UK, providing support to schools, mainly mainstream schools, but we've also got some special schools coming on board and wanting our support with teaching literacy. So it's an exciting time for us. So where have I come from? Next slide, please. So 33 years ago, my son was born. He's got cerebral palsy. I think it was 33 years ago. I always forget my kids' ages. He was very lucky, and I was very lucky because I was a friend of a guy called Paddy Ladd. We met over a mutual love of Bob Dylan in the early 1980s. And he introduced me to the disability rights movement well before I had my own disabled child. He used to come around the house with Rights Not Charity posters telling me how wrong it was that we had to rely on charity and blah, blah, blah. And so along came Dan, and I'll never forget the visiting peripatetic nurse who came around to see us and said to me, "So what do you think's wrong with your child?" This is when he was like a few weeks old. And I said, "Nothing." And she looked at me as if I was completely bats because he was obviously disabled. But thanks to that pre-knowledge, I came into being a parent in a very different way. When my son was 6 months old, a visiting teacher came along to see us and told us about the local school for children with profound and multiple learning difficulties, and said how good it would be for Dan. And I remember thinking, at 6 months old, you've defined him. At 6 months old, you've labelled him. And I said, well, actually, my older son goes to a very good mainstream school where I intend him to go, so he'll go there over my dead body. And it almost was, but he did go to mainstream and he stayed in all the way through. So that was my sort of background. Next slide, please. My first teaching job, I went into teaching when Dan was quite young, was a home education role for Zara, and she was being denied inclusion. I ended up teaching her the whole of Key Stage 1 at home while we waited to get her a place. Now, my son Dan was in Islington and she was in the next borough of Camden. And as this picture shows, we ended up on the steps of Camden Town Hall with my son holding up the banner, "I'm in mainstream school," and Zara holding up the banner, "Why am I not in mainstream school?" This photo actually went viral, and we were utterly amused to find it turn up in the video that Hillary Clinton used to try and become the president of the United States. And we thought, what's that doing there? But anyway, we're glad it's still around, that poster. So that's a bit of my background, and that's also a bit of where Candles come from. So moving on, So where were our influences? Well, I joined the Alliance for Inclusion when Dan was about 3 months old and learned about the social model of disability. And it's our aim to remove the barriers to inclusion in mainstream schools. That's what we stand for, that's who we are. But we were delighted when we got the opportunity to work at Impington Village College, which has been working for that same aim for quite a long time. Next. So Holly was the first student that we worked with at Impington Village College, and I was working with her in her junior school and really struggling to convince them that she is not learning disabled. Most of the students Candle work with don't use voices to speak, and there's such a perception still persisting that students who can't speak with conventional voices must have learning difficulties. It's one of the most difficult perceptions to shift, and it just simply isn't true. They might have learning difficulties, but there's no automatic presumption. And so this school was repeatedly teaching Holly to count to 10, was repeatedly teaching Holly the letters of the alphabet. She knew them all. She'd lost the will to live. She just wasn't interested. So of course she didn't answer the questions. And I love this this quote which Leah showed me. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results. So one of the things that we think is really important for teachers to learn is that if a student doesn't seem to be learning, what can I change? Not what can I change in the student, what can I change in the way I'm teaching so that that student can learn? Next slide. So when Holly was in, this is Holly and her two friends at primary, and what we did in year 5 when we were looking for a secondary school and thinking what is going to be next for her, we got Colin Newton's organisation Inclusive Solutions out to do a path for Holly, and that was really affirming, really positive, and it made us all think into the future and into a positive future, and helped Holly to start thinking into a positive future as well. PATH is, or I can't remember what it stands for, but anyway, a couple of years later, this is Holly ready to get in the van and head off on her first day at Impington Village College. Next. And I'm going to hand over to Leah, who's going to talk a little bit about Impington Village College and its ethos, and over to you, Leah.
Thank you very much, Marion. So as Marion said, I am the Senko at Impington Village College, although after listening to Sarah, I think I might be changing my job title, or considering it at least. So thank you very much for having me today. I'm not sure what any of you amazing people will be able to kind of learn from me. I've already learned so much from listening to Sarah, so I will at the very least be quick. Marion asked me just to give a little bit of background about the school that she's kind of working within. So we're in North Cambridge, we're a mainstream academy, and we're a secondary school with just over 1,000 students. We were built just after the Second World War as one of the first village colleges, and Henry Morris, the education officer at the time, had this vision for schools with a really strong moral purpose, and that the schools, the village colleges that he built, would really serve the community and serve the children in the community that live near those schools. And that's something that we have always been really keen to kind of keep hold of and to move forwards with, in terms of serving all of the children in our local community, but also in the wider community as well. We also, more recently in 1981, we had a special needs department open, a building called the Pavilion. That was opened, you can see the building in the bottom left picture there, behind Professor Stephen Hawking, who was our local celebrity and came to open it up at the time for us. And at the time, that building was intended to be kind of quite pioneering. It had fully accessible toilets and changing places, and it had has a sort of physiotherapy room and an on-site nurse. And the idea at the time was it would be one of the only schools in the area that was able to accept students in wheelchairs or students with physical disabilities. Now, of course, since then, you know, all schools have accessible toilets and changing places and things like that. We no longer have the on-site nurse, unfortunately. So one of the kind of key things that I wanted really to get across, you know, in speaking to you guys, was that we're just a normal school. There's actually nothing special about us as a school. You know, we have buildings, we have classrooms. I suppose luckily all of our buildings are ground level, which is helpful, you know, but schools have lifts these days. So there's absolutely nothing special about us. However, about 7% of our students do have EHCPs, so kind of roughly twice the national average. We have 80 students in the lower school that have EHCPs, and I think that's because we generally have, you know, quite a good reputation for supporting students, but also we're very welcoming. And when parents come and look around in year 6 to come and see our school, you know, a lot of the time, unfortunately, they say that their child's local school, or they'd been to other secondary schools and they didn't get a very welcoming response, and they didn't, you know, feel that their child was wanted at that school, and that's been different when they've come to look around Impington. So again, that's something that we're really proud of, and we now have students coming from far and wide to come and be supported by us. So you know, we have students that travel for an hour or so to get here, which is great, and we're proud of them, but bittersweet again for us, because I really wonder why there aren't closer schools to their house that are able to support them. And our ethos is and always has been to be inclusive, inspirational, and international. Oh, could I have the next slide, please? So Marion asked me just to talk a little bit about how we made the decision to offer places at Impington to students who use AAC. So that's what Marion's company comes and supports us with, so alternative and augmentative communication. Tell me if I've got that wrong, Marion. So that's what they support us with. But you know, I thought about this for a long time, and there actually really wasn't a decision. So you know, when we get those EHCPs land on our desk and we get students that want to apply or want to attend the school, there isn't really a decision about, you know, shall we have this student or shall we not? And I really like what somebody else said about, you know, it's not can we, it's how are we going to do this? And so immediately it was, right, this is happening, we've got a few months to sort it out, how are we going to do this? And it was very apparent that we couldn't just send the student off to the mainstream class with their peers, have a TA sat next to them, and they would just listen to the teacher. TA would write for them, scribe for them, you know, they would do yes and no's. It was very apparent that just isn't going to be good enough, and maybe they would be physically included in the school and in the class, but maybe not academically included or socially included, and what that would mean for the student. So luckily, Marion's company was already involved with the young person when she was at primary school, so it made a lot of sense for her to kind of continue to be involved and to keep them involved, and you know, ever since then, thank goodness that we did. And I think kind of my second point that I really wanted to kind of make clear was that I think sometimes secondary schools can be maybe reluctant to ask for help or get external help or get external people to come and advise them, and I think a lot of the time that's maybe sometimes associated with things like Ofsted and having people come in and inspect you and having these outsiders come in and sort of tell you what to do, and that can be a little bit scary at first, but you know, if you don't know the answer and you don't know how to support these young people, go and find somebody who does, because there are people out there you know, who have this experience and this knowledge, and there is no way I would have been able to become an expert in all of the things that Candle are experts in even in the 5 years that she's been here. Marion's tried to teach me lots of times how to use the IT and the equipment, and you know, I think I'm quite good with IT, but not that good. You know, it's not easy. There's lots of transdisciplinary working, there's lots of professionals involved. You know, we've had an annual review with 21 people in attendance, and kept it to time, I might add. So you know, that's never ever easy, but it's definitely worth it, and I can see why other mainstream schools or secondary schools might be reluctant to get involved in you know, such big kind of working teams, but it's absolutely worth it, and we would never have been able to achieve, or you know, or Holly would never have been able to achieve the things that she has without this kind of support and this team around her. But really, I think it's all about the attitude of the school, and the attitude of the people that are working in the school, because we really try to be very, very flexible and very willing to try new things to support these young people. So I think quite often in schools you come up against this attitude of, oh, but we don't usually do that, or oh, we haven't done that in the past, or oh, no, we can't do that because we haven't done it before. And it's really trying to kind of get out of that mindset and try and get out of that mindset and do new things that maybe they work or maybe they don't, and you keep kind of trying and keep thinking about ideas. And Marian's been incredible at kind of getting us to think outside of the box. And if there's anyone who is a compassionate agitator, I think it's definitely Marian. But you know, she's taught us a lot really about that. You don't have to do what you've usually done, and you can change the way that you do things. So for example, you know, when students come to choosing their kind of options choices in year 9, you know, for GCSEs, lots of people say, you know, you have to choose one option from each block, or you can't choose 2 options from each block. No, we don't have students that do this and this. But you know, if you're willing to kind of think outside the box and think of different ways of doing things, then it's, of course it's possible. And really, that, you know, most things are possible, and it's not can we, it's how can we, and how can we do that. So that's something that I'm going to be sort of taking forwards really with me. So I think the point that I wanted to make is that you don't have to be a special school. That there doesn't have to be something special about it. You don't have to be a certain type of mainstream school. You don't have to be a certain type of school. You don't have to have a certain type of staff body to be able to support these students really, really well, and to be able to kind of push forwards and do things that haven't been done before. And you know, we're really lucky to have these professionals on board, and to be accepting more students, which I think Marian and Katia will tell you a little bit about next.
But before we go on to that, this was a very interesting model that we put together. I think this was the first annual review, wasn't it, Leah?
I think it was the first, yeah.
So this was when Holly was in year 7. She's in year 10 now, so she's in her GCSE course at the moment. So what we realised was that she was being pulled in all sorts of different directions. So there was the physios and the people saying she needed to build up her physical strength and development. There was the inevitable need for personal care support. But then there was her aspirations, which actually were more around wanting friendships and wanting to learn and wanting to achieve in the curriculum. And that was always in danger of being consumed by the other 2 strands of building up her physical strength and her personal care needs. But actually, when you look at this model, you see that actually there are an awful lot more elements to the social and emotional and educational side of Holly than there are the other. So there was a lot of work to be done around all of that. For Holly, the most important thing was having friends, and that was a real struggle for her, because as a non-speaking person, even the peers would assume she didn't understand anything and talk to her like this, which she hated. Next slide, please. So we brought Colin Newton and his gang in again. And they are helping us, and have been helping us over a fairly long period of time, to support Holly with a circle of support, which the group of young people called the Purple Circle. That's just what they went for. Most young people prefer the colour purple, as do I. So this is the very first meeting of the circle, where everybody, the young people themselves, that volunteered to wrap themselves around Holly, sat with Holly and thought about her needs and how they could be helpful. And that's developing into real genuine friendships, which is great. Next. Right, high expectations are the key to academic success. So having just looked at that strand that's about relationships, this is my little model I've just invented of why we need high expectations and why we should not be baselining students or teaching students from a baseline position. So these 2 big thick brown lines, the one at the bottom is where we often assess students. Right, this is we look at what they can't do, and we say, right, they need to learn all these things they can't do. And the big thick line at the top is where a student, their age, you know, the age appropriate sort of average might be. Now the reality is no student is at a baseline. All of these little brown lines, they're all the things that student that we've just assessed can do. Some of the things might be above age appropriate, some of the things might be down near that baseline we could alternatively give them. And all those circles, there might be the holes, the gaps in that person's knowledge. So what we advocate as an organisation that supports teaching is we say, go to the top, go to the age appropriate teaching, and then fill in the gaps. You're going to, next slide, and I'm so glad Sarah's been talking about the zone of proximal development, because that's also our favourite phrase. If you work in that way, you are helping that student to get into the top of their zone of proximal development, to get to the top of where they can be in terms of educational achievement. And the important thing when you're teaching a student, and I would say this is true of all students, never mind whether you're a disabled student or not, is that what you can do with appropriate help says far more about your potential and far more about your possibilities for the future than what you can do in a test. So when we do assessments, we do what we call dynamic assessments. We do a little bit of teaching and see how you learn. We do not give people tests and come up with numbers, because we don't find that helps. The least dangerous assumption, which I'm sure lots of you have come across, if a student finds it difficult to demonstrate their understanding and we presume that they don't understand, what hope do they have of learning? If we incorrectly presume someone can learn something, what have we lost? Not very much. But what have we lost if we don't teach? We've lost everything, and so has that student. Next slide, please. Over to you, Katia, because you're the teacher working for us in Impington Village College.
Hello. So I think lots have been said. We started with Holly, and we now have 3 students at IVC. They are all non-verbal or with very little speech, so they all rely on augmentative and alternative communication. As you can see, they have different access both to communicate and to access the curriculum. They all attend mainstream lessons, and they have one-to-one session as well. Next slide. This is just an example how we adapt learning for our students, so they have the same learning opportunities as their peers, and they can have exactly the same learning activities, and they access everything: textbooks, worksheets, lessons, everything. We adapt them on their devices so they can access to them. Next slide. Talking from my perspective as an external professional, I must say that I don't feel as external at IVC because we always work as a team for the student. So we work alongside Leah and all the teachers and the SEN manager and the care team, just, you know, to make it possible. I think the key is just to make it possible. So we don't see each other as an organization who comes to visit or to participate in the students' academic life, but we see us as part of the IVC community. Next slide. I think it's important to highlight the idea of success, and I love this quote: each child is unique, not only capable of learning, but also capable of succeeding. We have to look at all the differences so we can have different methods, different strategies. And I think at IVC we have a great response because the students feel included. And I think, moving on to the next slide, I think the key is flexibility. At IVC, the students have different curriculum if they need it. they have a amended timetable, they have their care needs met, they can even change their groups if they need, they can have different teachers, and different paths are offered to them. I think it's more the school adapting to each student rather than the student adapting to the school, and looking more at the opportunities than at all the difficulties we know we have in schools. So as Leah said, we don't say we don't do this, or we have never done that. We have a go and we look at the opportunities. And the 4 aspects I would highlight in terms of inclusion are the time the students spend in mainstream lessons, interacting with their peers and having the same learning opportunities. The friendship groups, obviously, with Elliot and Colin's support. The high expectations we have on our students, and the participation in extracurriculum activities, trips that IVC make possible for them. And I think, Marion, you want to finish our presentation, don't you?
Okay, I will do, yes. So I think what we're trying to give you really is a snapshot of one of the schools we're working with, that we've found to be one of the most forward-thinking schools that we have worked with. And I think the reason that it's having such a success is down to that can-do attitude, down to that never thinking it can't be done. We're looking at some options for the future for Holly at the moment, and we're not going, it can't be done. We're going, how can we make that happen? And we're looking at them with her as well, obviously. And that is the key. It's actually the absolute fundamental key. With a lot of other schools we're working with, we're at the early stages of actually trying to share the things that are possible. I'm actually in a really difficult situation with a sixth form college, where they're actually saying that a student who we found is perfectly capable of GCSEs can't do them because it's just not what they do. And it's so unfair to push somebody down a road that A, they don't want to go down, and B, don't need to go down. That's why I'm really excited to be sharing the collaborative work that we've been able to do with IVC, and very happy to open up at this stage to comments, questions, discussions, and anything that anybody would like to say.
Fab, thank you so far, Katia, Leah and Marion. I know there'll be comments. What I found myself thinking about as you just showed those models about the way that you work and the way that you make the environment change for the young person is Eleanor Roosevelt, when she made the Declaration of Human Rights, where she talked about the importance of human rights in all sorts of small places, in farms, in factories, in classrooms. And we don't always know that actually what we're doing is something so pivotal. It is about our right to be human. And I felt that with what you've shared with us. So thank you. I'm going to see if there's any comments or any hands.
We haven't stunned everyone into silence.
I'm just happy. I think Jay Rose. Not sure of your first name, Jay.
Hello, was that did you say Jenny?
So we're having a bit of echo, so I'm going to put my mic off in a moment, but could we have Jay Rowlands and then Adela after Jay, please?
Hello, yes, can you hear me? Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so it's Jenny. That was just amazing and really inspiring. I'm a parent whose child's just about to start secondary school, and to be honest, I'm filled with dread about it. We've had a fantastic primary experience, and that gives me some hope, but there seems to be a bit of hiding around behind funding and kind of, you know, that these issues aren't because we don't want to, it's because we're not funded correctly. So I just wondered if there's any, you know, kind of anywhere we can go with that, or what, you know, is that the truth, or is it that they just don't want to try it?
Hiya.
Oh, sorry, can I say something about that?
Yeah, go ahead, Marion.
It's just that we do a lot of work with funding, and actually the provision that we give isn't cheap. It is, you know, it can't be, because we're bringing in teachers and people to support. But what we found is, if you demonstrate the need, if you actually get the local authority to see the need, the funding follows. It has to. So it's about demonstrating need, and it's about proving that it can be done through demonstrating need. That's what we've found. They have to fund once the need is demonstrated.
Right, yeah, so yeah, okay, no, that's good to know. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, were you going to come in too?
To be honest, I was going to say very much the same thing as Marion. You know, of course, you know, the support and all of these things aren't cheap, and it has to be supported by the local authority. But we have found that where you can give a really, really clear picture of why that support is needed, and what you'll do with it and what the impact of it will be, that they have been supportive. And like somebody said in the chat, you know, it might be cheaper than an out of area special school, might be cheaper than lots of different alternatives. And I know it shouldn't come down to this, but again, you know, there are plenty of people out there with expertise who are willing to lend their time, or willing to offer resources and support that maybe wouldn't be so expensive, or come and see how other schools do things. You know, there are ways around things. But yeah, of course, funding is always a big block. You know, when I say that we get these applications from students, and we say, how can we do this? You know, not can we do this, but how can we do this? A big part of that is having the right funding, because you can't always do what you want to do, or what you know that you need to do, if the money isn't there for it, unfortunately. So that is one of the barriers that is the hardest probably to overcome.
Louise in the chat box says that funding is often presented to be the main barrier. I think that there's that sense you get when you go somewhere that this place is going to welcome and include me, because there's something about the ethos and the values, and people who want to make it happen. Jenny, I think, have that set of values that clearly Marion, Katia and Leah share, that what will it take, and then we'll worry about the money later, because there'll be a way, we'll find a way. Thank you. I think Adela, you were going to come in, weren't you?
Yes, I just wanted to say to the ladies, I wanted to congratulate them on their hard work and how supportive they've been to sort of colleagues, families, their actual pupils, and that speaks volumes. And what they've done is change people's lives, because without that sort of intervention and someone there and a sort of scaffolding that sort of learners learning and support, they wouldn't have had the opportunity. So I just wanted to say, you know, congratulations on all your hard work.
Thank you very much.
Bringing tears to my eyes now.
Nice to be thanked, isn't it, and acknowledged. In the chat box earlier, somebody, I think, thinking about language as we did in Sarah's session, I think we had a query about, you know, what's the right terminology? Is it non-verbal or pre-verbal? Because we're not sure.
I always use the term non-verbal. I'll tell you why. Because pre-verbal, by some specialists, is taken to mean you haven't learned to understand us yet. Whereas non-verbal is just an I don't talk thing. So that's the reason why I use non-verbal. I don't talk with my voice. I use non-disabled.
Yeah. I know pre-sounds like we're going to get there sometime, maybe not now.
Not everyone is going to speak.
That might never be my mode of communication, thanks.
Or setting you up to fail, calling you a pre anything.
Right, I've got to update my language now, but that's okay. I like to learn. And Linda, you're going to come in now.
Yeah, it was just a colleague of ours who's speaking this afternoon, Tricia Nicol. I've worked with Tricia for many years, and she's got a lot of expertise in working with all young people with different challenges. And she always uses the phrase, doesn't use words to speak, or doesn't use words to speak at the moment. And it's a way of getting across that we all communicate. It's just that some people don't use words. I just wondered what you thought about that.
I certainly find that easier than the pre idea. But I think it is. I think you've picked up on a really important point there, Linda, which it's about alternative means of communication. That's why it's called AAC. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it is alternative and augmentative communication, which means we communicate in many ways. And I think that's the key thing to get across. And in a way, even non-verbal's a bit of a struggle, because it's still a non-thing, whereas actually you are communicating. But I've never found a snappy short way of saying it.
Yeah, I mean, I do quite a lot of work in schools, and I'm always shocked at the low aspirations and expectations in many places for young people with the PMLD label.
Oh God, yeah.
And there's this huge assumption that they can't kind of do very much or anything, and all of the kind of concentration day to day is on building skills, rather than what is a good life for this young person and what can we do to build a really good life. And it's that concept that if you can't, you can't, and you can't, and you can't, and it's like you can't do that until you're ready, and you can't do that until you're ready, and you've got to be at this level before you can do that. And when we talk about stuff like employment, you know, work experience, doing vocational profiles, we don't get a very strong response. It's like, what? They're not ready for that. You know, they're not ready to have friends, or they're not ready to learn that thing or that thing. So it's a big issue, you know, because if someone doesn't use words to speak, people forget that they can communicate in all sorts of ways. And, you know, there's that statistic that you can probably confirm what it is about how much of our communication is verbal. It's a very small amount, isn't it?
Yes,
and that so much of it, it's something like 20% or less, or something quite remarkable. So it's that, you know, we've got to try and build that understanding that we all communicate. Everybody communicates. We use body language, we use facial expression, we use all sorts of, you know, hand gestures, signing. It's a big issue. It's a really big issue, and I think we need to talk about it more.
Yeah, I agree.
I agree, Linda. I think I used to be able to use AAC in a way as shorthand to explain that I did mean someone who used different styles of communication, but that is no longer widely understood, I think, because we've not been making the adjustments right across the piece in mainstream as well as in special provision. So let's take a little bit of a curve now. We've obviously been thinking about some of your brilliant work and the brilliant work at Derby College, but wherever you are in the country, we'd like to know a bit about you and what you're doing or what you're thinking, or any of the ideas that you've had when you've heard Marion, Katia and Leah and Sarah this morning, and any things that you might be thinking about trying out or doing differently. So I do know a few people on the call, and if I don't see any hands, I might well call you in if that's okay. So there you go, Nikki's commented. And I think this is for you, Nikki, this is as a family member. The school thinks they're adjusting enough, bespoke in the curriculum. So Nikki, what would you like to happen? They're saying ask for more funding.
Hello.
Hi, Nikki.
Hi. It just seems to be an ongoing battle that they just keep saying their managers want people to do GCSEs and they are not enough staff. It wouldn't be fair on the other pupils if he did, you know, all more of the practical things and less theory, or the one-to-one took him out. He does have one-to-one for the whole week, and they say, well, that doesn't happen anymore. We're far more adaptable, or it doesn't happen. And they say if I try and get the HC plan changed, in today's climate, probably have the funding removed or the hours removed, and they feel that they are doing enough. Well, they haven't done it yet, but bespoke you know, programme planning for next September. But I feel the differentiation of the work is not enough and consistent, which has been the cause of him getting more and more demotivated, really. But he's physically able, he's very verbal, he's gone there more to, you know, more for the language and the social skills. That gives him impression of being more able than he is, and the actual working on retaining information is not very good. He has Down syndrome. He just is not motivated to learn and revise. But they are adamant they want him to work towards GCSEs until year 11.
So I'm wondering, with Marion, Katia and Leah on the call, if they've got any suggestions or any clarifying questions for you.
Hiya, can you hear me?
Hi, yes.
It's really good because Leah, you've had experiences of having to adapt for different groups, haven't you?
Yeah, I'll do my very best to give some advice. It's obviously difficult, you know, without knowing the specific situation and the school's point of view. But I suppose my first piece of advice would be, is there somebody that you can call upon, whether it's a parent support group, or, I mean, we have something down here in our area called NDTi or Parent Partnership. You know, is there somebody that you can call upon to, you know, to go and attend those meetings at school with you, and who can maybe, you know, quote things like the you know, Equalities Act and things like that, that might just give you a little bit of, might make you feel a little bit more confident in asking for the right things. But also, you know, I do think sometimes with schools that sort of thing does make people sit up and listen, and it does make people sort of pay attention to the things that they are supposed to be doing, because it sounds to me like it's not appropriate for him to be sitting in these GCSE classes, and that perhaps he might just be sort of sitting there not taking anything in and not academically included, and that kind of waiting until year 11 to make that choice might be too late for him and detrimental to him at that point. So, you know, it's kind of having those conversations about having somebody with you to support you and that can kind of help you to advocate for him, and making sure that his views are put across as well. I mean, I know that doesn't really kind of give you the answers. It sounds to me like you're asking for the right things, you know, and I understand all the pushback about funding and probably getting less. Maybe, I guess it depends on the local authority and the area.
They are sort of, you know, they say, well, it's a mainstream and there's about 1,000 pupils, and they have a small group, although he's in some large classes. The one they say is in small groups for some things. He only has SALT therapy and some social stories sometimes. They said he needs the consistent programme, and also they say that he's not the lowest ability in the class, and so I am reducing his potential because I'm asking for him. But in fact, when we had like a very brief parents' evening last week on the computer, several minutes with each teacher, and it kept cutting off to the next one, they were saying, and we don't see the teacher very often, but they were actually saying that they didn't know how he was going to manage the GCSEs. You know, they were mentioning functional English, functional maths, Nth level. I don't want to take everybody's time up. It's just that when you come across a blockage, it's lovely having people like you who know what you're doing and want it to get better. But when you've got a blockage and they're saying the managers say this, managers say that, that's not what we do here. That is so old-fashioned. I know the law. I know it's just they, you know, and then they threaten with, well, you should be looking at specialist, and he doesn't fit in to a
inclination as well would be, you know, if it doesn't work in this school, he's in a mainstream school, if this doesn't work, what's your alternative? And like you said, the alternative is a specialist school, and they're surely far and away much more expensive. So I would wonder if getting the local authority involved and asking about more funding and asking about a bespoke programme maybe would be the way to go, because surely it's cheaper than the alternative, and you know, unfortunately things are very much driven by money and what's cheaper and what's more expensive, and that might be what gets the kind of the conversation moving with your casework officer.
Yes,
and I think you've had a lovely offer, Nikki, in the box from Linda Jordan, from the National Development Team for Inclusion, who's been the arbiter of all of the organisation around this event, where Linda's offered, if you get in touch with her, NDTi do offer some support to individual circumstances, and sometimes a call from NDTi does make a difference to a school and a local authority, because there is this other body with a wealth of knowledge about how we can make adjustments and what is reasonable, and how we can find ways to make school fit your son instead of your son rather fit the school, because that's part of what we're asking, isn't it? Who are schools open for? Young people. So who do we serve? Everybody. Then we make the adjustments. We change in the model that you showed so clearly at IVC, so that we can make the arrangement, the adjustment to make it work for him.
Yeah,
So,
it just feels, yeah, that's lovely. I'll you know, can talk to Linda. It is just like, you know, they make you feel that you're asking for something impossible, and you know, and it's always the well, not always, but it feels like, you know, if you're in the wrong place, it's a battle. But this is lovely to see. It's inspiring and really good. Thank you.
Thanks, Nikki. It's a bit of a postcode lottery, isn't it? If you were lucky enough to live near to where Leah, Katia are, you'd have a different experience.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else? I'm thinking of my friend up in Durham, Sam Black, if she's still on the call. Sam, I was thinking that, wondered whether you had any thoughts about how the Derby FE experience connects with where you are, because sometimes, and I think Nikki had this sense of it, sometimes what we're seeing in this great practice is a distance from where we want to be, and part of the challenge is how do we all get to a great place for our young people? I'm picking on you, Sam.
No, that's fine. Don't worry. It's absolutely fine. I think for me, the things I've been sort of the notes I've been taking is around the sort of the fact that we're all here together talking about the same thing and sharing the same messages, and the power of that. And I think that's something that we very much, you know, sort of are doing in Durham, and is really important to us. So I think it's that shared message. I've also written down the language that we use. I've really taken that on board today, and the importance of that. And I think that's something that you know, we need to think more about. I think particularly from the presentation from Sarah earlier, that's really made me think more about how we do that, and the messages that we're getting across. I'm meeting with Sarah in a few weeks, so I'll be quizzing her more about that. And I know, you know, we our colleagues from Durham were invited. I shared the invite yesterday, Pat, and I know there are some colleagues on today, which is brilliant, which is a huge step for us. And you know, sort of welcome the opportunity really to be able to sort of be part of things like this, and continue to you know, sort of share these messages. So I think, you know, small steps, as everyone is saying, but heading in the right direction, which is, you know, really exciting.
Fab. So before I thank our wonderful presenters this morning, can I just invite you to put into the chat box one thing that you're going to take away and try or do differently, having heard this session, because it would be great to know that we're making our own pledges for inclusion. And while you're doing that and they start to come in, I'm just going to thank Marion, Katia, Leah and Sarah earlier on for incredible contributions. You know, the motivation, when you feel where we can be, you want to be part of that, don't you? I want to be part of that. I want to be a more compassionate agitator, and continue to make change happen like you all have. So thank you so much. And I've just looked, and what people are doing is leaving the meeting and not telling me what their next step is. How rude. Oh, thank you, Rebecca. You've given me back my faith in humanity. Continue to ask, what can we do, and encourage all the agencies we work with to do the same. Katia, language, that's been really important. a better understanding of what inclusion means and some of the key terminology, thinking about language within EHCPs and meetings. And Leah said, you're welcome. Looking forward to watching the problem of the able-bodied now, and much more to think about. Challenging language, greater focus on individual plans, how we might indoctrinate the world with inclusion. Good to see you thinking small again, Sarah. Keep on asking the questions in the belief we can make a difference. Move away from talking about funding and more about needs and how they're met. Yeah, it's a smoke screen. Thank you, everyone. I'm not going to read them all out now. I'm just going to see if anyone else wants to have a final word. So thank you. We can do it together, can't we? Those pledges that Sarah talked about are so powerful. And I think that from this festival, Linda, will there be any other steps that we take together at NDTi?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, we've got big plans. We're going to get together after Easter and plan a strategy for NDTi. So Jane Friswell, who chaired one of the sessions yesterday, who's a board member, she's going to support us to take proposals for a strategy to the board, and the strategy will be hopefully making an impact nationally. So one of the things we want is to develop a charter that we want to spread far and wide across the country and get people to sign up to. Yeah, we've got lots of ideas. So this week isn't going to stand in isolation.
No,
and all of your wonderful contributions are going to really help us. It's fantastic that we've had so many people sign up this week, because I think it proves that inclusion has not gone away, it's not going away, and it's here, and we're brave and bold about it.
There's and it's been so brilliant to hear some families or parents of young people being able to tell us that today too. So let's keep on agitating, and go and have a lunch break if you can, because I think a lot of us are sitting at the desk, aren't we, currently, and not getting a break. Thank you so much, everybody, especially our presenters, but all of you too.